The wisdom of the world says, "Blessed are the rich and the wealthy, for money is the key to happiness." But Jesus says, "Blessed are the poor, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." The world says, "Blessed are those who always have a positive attitude, for they are more pleasant to be around." Jesus says, "Blessed are those who mourn, for they will be comforted." The world says, "Blessed are the strong, for they will overcome any challenge." Jesus says, "Blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth." The world's wisdom says, "Blessed are those who have abundance, lots of stuff, for it shows they are successful." Jesus says, "Blessed are those who hunger and thirst, for they will be filled." The world says, "Blessed are those who do whatever it takes to get whatever they want." Jesus says, "Blessed are the merciful, for they will receive mercy." The world's wisdom says, "Blessed are those who remain silent, who don't challenge the status quo, or nobody really wants to change." And Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven." Finally, the world says, "Blessed are the mighty military, for through the strength of arms we will be safe." Yet Jesus says, "Blessed are the peacemakers, for they will be called children of God." It is clear that the world values money, values power, values positivity. Yet Jesus seems to value the poor, the meek, hungry and thirsty, the merciful. The world sees those things as weakness, things to be exploited, things you don't show, because you might get taken advantage of, you might get run over. We're supposed to show a strong, united front. We're supposed to show that we're strong, we're independent, we can do things on our own. And yet Jesus says, "Blessed are those who are weak, who are despised, who are lonely." The world sees it as foolishness. Why should we find strength in weakness? Yet that is exactly what God does. Salvation doesn't come through a conqueror who rules over the nations. Salvation comes from a man who suffers and dies on a cross. Foolishness. Why would God choose to save the world through an act of death and suffering? Well, I'm going to do something a little different today. I don't have a manuscript with me. And the reason being is because I'm going to share with you my story, my Paul story. Because I can't think of any greater example of God's foolishness than God's willingness to call me to be a pastor. And, well, if you don't like what I have to say, well, I'm leaving in a couple weeks, so you can complain to your new pastor. I am someone who has always been overweight, according to physical health standards. Part of this is due to my genetic makeup. Part of this is due to the fact that I had a very poor role model in my mother, who took horrible care of her own physical health. And part of it was my love for food. I have a huge love for food. I'm a foodie extreme. But also food for a long time was a means of therapy for me. It was how I coped with the hardships of life. And unfortunately, it developed into a food addiction, which I still battle with today. But because of this, I spent pretty much all of my life overweight. And as a kid, being overweight, I got bullied a lot. I remember a story from my 4th grade year. My school had just announced that they were going to do this charity fundraiser called the Mathathon. And a couple years ago at a previous school, I participated in the same charity. And me being excited that my school was going to do this, I told the teacher in my class that I had done the Mathathon. Well, there was a guy named Steve. He was my token bully. And after I made this, I had told the teacher in the class that I participated in that before. Steve went, "What did he say?" And the teacher said, "Well, Zach just said that he had participated in that fun." Steve, ever the bully, looking for this wonderful opportunity, said to the whole class, "Oh, I thought he said he participated in the marathon." This bullying I experienced as a child didn't help my self-esteem. But in addition to that, I also had a mother who was severely depressed. She developed depression around when I was 6 or 7 years of age. And because she was severely depressed, it was really hard for her to be present for our kids. It was really hard for her to be a mother to us. She wasn't around much. She was either fluffing us off to daycare so she didn't have to deal with us, or she was gone, 3 hours away, meeting with her doctor and her therapist. I had a very strong connection with my mother, probably because we both grew up as middle children. And so, not having my mother present was devastating. It filled me with a sense of abandonment and other emotions that at the time I couldn't understand or process. Just that I knew I didn't like my mother not being around. And it made me sad. So, fast forward to a few years later. It's New Year's Eve. And my dad and my siblings and I were playing board games, waiting to bring in the new year. And my mother was in bed, like she was most of the time. And we encouraged my father to go and get Mom, because we wanted her to participate in the fun we were having. We missed her. We wanted her to join us. So my dad went back to the bedroom. Next thing we know, there's an ambulance pulling up to our house. My mother had decided to swallow an entire bottle of aspirin. So the rest of New Year's Eve was spent at the hospital, wondering about the condition of my mother. Now, thankfully, she recovered. But shortly after that, she decided that she needed to leave the family. She needed to go and rediscover herself. So she left to come back to the state of Iowa, because she said the luckiest time in her life was when she was at seminary at work. She and my dad had. So she left us, went back to Iowa, and left my dad to raise the 3 of us kids by himself. Now my dad was a parish pastor at a very active congregation in Washington, So you can imagine the stress he must have felt having to be a solo pastor to a very involved congregation and raising us 3 kids. Think of 3 Catherines here. Having to raise us 3 kids by himself. And my father noticed that I was starting to develop some bad health habits with eating and lack of exercise. And he started getting scared that I was turning into my mother. And so he was very hard on me during that time, because he didn't know what else to do, which didn't help my emotions. Because every time my dad yelled at me, I shrank and shrank and shrank. So eventually, we moved back to Iowa and reunited with my mother. We moved to this town of Lake Mills, north of here. And it was rough for me at first, because no one seemed to really like me. Because I was that weird kid from Washington who wore sweatpants all the time, who just didn't really fit in, wasn't normal. What they didn't know is that I started a trend, because by high school, everybody wanted to wear sweatpants on a daily basis. Although they never gave me credit for that. But it took them a long time to accept me. By high school, things were much better. By high school, I had a group of friends. I had my girlfriend, Kristen, who, yes, is now my wife. And I had a faith community. When I started high school, I joined Cedar Lutheran Church, where my mother was an associate pastor, because they had a church choir. And I just rediscovered my love for singing. And so I wanted to continue to sing, so I joined that church so I could sing in the church choir. I found a wonderful, supportive faith community in Salem Lutheran Church. For the first time, they didn't see me as someone who was flawed, as someone who was struggling. They saw me as a gifted child of God, and they affirmed that for me. They saw that I was a strong youth leader who got me involved with things. It was even the senior pastor there, who was the first pastor I ever had who wasn't my parents, who even whispered and planted that first seed in me, asking if I had ever thought about going to seminary. This was after I had prayed a prayer during worship, and he thought it was a very exceptional prayer, and afterwards he took me aside and said, "Zach, have you ever thought about going to seminary?" And I said, "No, I don't want to do that. That's what my parents do." But high school was a good time in my life, except for my senior year. See, right after my junior year, my mother accepted a new call to be the pastor at Zion Lutheran Church in Cedar, Iowa, just 45 minutes up the road from here. And my dad accepted a call to be a full-time hospice chaplain at Cedar Valley Hospice in Waterloo. First of all, as a teenager, I was thinking, you guys couldn't have waited 1 more year to do this? So I went to them and I said, "Can I please finish my senior year at Lake Mills? I'm sick of all the moving around. I'm sick of all the changes. I'd like to stay at Lake Mills." And of course, there was some incentive for me to do that. My friends were here, and Kristen was there. So my parents agreed, and they found a family for me from church for me to stay with. I was thinking that I would stay with one of my friends' families, but my parents said, "No, this is who you're going to stay with." So my senior, for the first 7-8 months of my senior year of high school, I stayed with this family. And it was not a good fit. Our personalities clashed too much. We were just raised differently, and we had different understandings different work ethics, different philosophies, and it created a lot of tension between us. And we put up with that tension for 8 months. It was like walking on eggshells the entire time. And I was unhappy with that. Again, not quite sure why, but unhappy. Eventually, we did part ways, and I finished off my senior year with the family that I originally wanted to. Graduated with honors, graduated with my class. Things were well again. Until I went to college. It was at college that things finally came to a head. All the issues of my childhood, of my adolescence, the things that I used food to cope with, all came together. And I developed my own deep depression. And I suffered a lot during college because of that depression, but also because I didn't know how to handle this independence that I had gotten in college. I didn't know how to hold myself accountable. I didn't know how to motivate myself. Part of that was depression. And so I stopped attending classes. I stopped doing homework. Friends would bang on my dorm room door for a long time, and I wouldn't answer. I became very isolated and continued to fall into the deep depression I was in. Well, somehow, in the fall semester of my sophomore year, I became aware enough that something was missing in my life. And Kristen and I talked about it one evening, and I came to realize that when I started college, I went to church maybe 1 or 2 times, but then I stopped going. I stopped going to church because I was overwhelmed with my depression, I was overwhelmed with holding myself accountable, and I just wasn't doing it. So we had decided that, maybe what would help is if we got back involved in faith. So we knew that the Lutheran Student Center at the University of Northern Iowa had a Wednesday evening 9 p.m. service. So we decided to go for the first time. And when we got there, we were immediately greeted by all the others that were there, and it was like we had been a part of that faith community all along, with their welcomes and greetings and hospitality. So after a little bit of time of fellowship, we went up for worship. And Pastor Diane, I'll never forget that sermon she preached. In her sermon, she talked about how God never gives up on us. That even when we turn our backs on God, God doesn't turn God back on us. God is always there, ready to embrace us. That we are beloved children of God, and that is who we truly are. Because of that, God will never forsake us. That sermon is exactly what I needed to hear. It reminded me that God's been there the entire time. So Kristen and I started getting more actively involved in that faith community, and the pastor there immediately recognized my gifts and got me involved as the worship team leader to help plan worship for the week. And she and I would have lots of conversations about my gifts and my skills and my strengths, about my hardships, my challenges. She helped me get connected with a counselor, which helped a little bit. I ended up not sticking with that counselor because she just wasn't a good fit for me, but it started to help me a little bit. But Pastor Diane recognized my gifts, and she kept on affirming those gifts and kept on asking me, Zach, what about seminary? What about seminary? You'd make a great pastor. And again, my response to her would be, oh, I don't want to do that. That's what my parents do. Now that was my external excuse. But on the inside, what I was really thinking was, how can I be a pastor when I am so broken? Pastors are supposed to be perfect. Pastors are supposed to be right next to God. Pastors are supposed to have it all figured out and all together so that they can lead people with faithfulness. Pastors aren't supposed to be broken people who suffer from depression, who have eating disorders. That's not who pastors are supposed to be. And you know, the ironic thing is that I knew my parents weren't perfect, especially my mother. And yet I still had this idea that pastors were supposed to be perfect. Well, thankfully, like Pastor Diane said, God never gives up on us. And the Spirit just kept poking me. Finally, I felt the poke enough to say, all right, it's clear you want me to go to seminary, God. I'll go. There's a saying among seminarians that if you don't go into your call kicking and screaming, it's not for you. So, thankfully, I had a wonderful visit at LSTC, Lutheran School of Theology at Chicago. And it was another one of those situations where the people there automatically welcomed me and my spouse and acted like we had been part of the community the entire time. And it was that sense of hospitality that said, okay, this is where I need to go. And in the fall of 2008, I started my seminary classes at LSTC, and I loved everything that I was learning. I loved all my biblical studies classes, my practical ministry classes, my theology classes. I loved it all. But even though I was really enjoying myself with these classes and learning all about these things, there was part of me inside that still felt like, am I really called to be a pastor? Because I still felt very broken. And even though the candidacy committee in Northeast Iowa had entranced me into the call process, or into the process to become a full-fledged ordained pastor in the LCA, I still had my doubts. Well, the summer following your first year of seminary, most students complete this thing called clinical pastoral education. And it usually takes place at a hospital, a medical center, at a hospice, or a nursing home. And you go in with this understanding that you're going to learn how to administer pastoral care to people who are sick and in need of some pastoral care. What they don't tell you is that what CPE really is a journey of self-discovery. And so on that very first day of CPE, me and my other fellow students and our CPE supervisor got together, and my CPE supervisor looked at me first and said, Zach, tell us your story. I said, okay. So I told my story. But I told the G-rated version. I highlighted all the wonderful things that went on in my life. I highlighted all the good experiences I had. I highlighted all the positive ways God worked in my life and helped me to discern my call. It was a very lovely story. But my CPE supervisor, she could see right through me. And she looked at me and said, Zach, that was a very nice story. Now tell us the real story. So I did. I shared the real story. The story of my hardships in childhood and adolescence. The story of my severe depression in college. And when I finished, feeling rather broken and still having that question in my mind, am I really called to be a pastor? She says, my supervisor says, Zach, I have a scripture reading that reminds me of your story. So she opens her Bible and begins to read. Consider your own call, brothers and sisters. Not many of you were wise by human standards. Not many were powerful. Not many were of noble birth. But God chose what is foolish in the world to shame the wise. God chose what is weak in the world to shame the strong. God chose what is low and despised in the world, things that are not, reduced to nothing the things that are, so that no one might boast in the presence of God. And throughout that summer of self-discovery, and the fact that she read that text to me, I started having an epiphany. And I started to think, wait, are you telling me that God has called me because I am broken? What I began to realize, when I reflected on my life up to that point, was the presence of God amidst all the suffering I had gone through. But what I also realized was every time I went through a bout of suffering for whatever reason and survived it changed and formed my heart into a greater sense of compassion and mercy. And it was then that I realized that the reason God called me to be a pastor was because God saw strength in my sense of compassion and mercy for others. Because every time I suffered, God took that suffering and turned it in to that compassion and that love and that mercy. And God said to me, you are going to need that, Zach. Because where I am sending you, other people will be broken. Other people will suffer. Other people will go through challenges, and you will be able to walk alongside of them because of your sense of compassion and mercy. Foolishness, right? Absolute foolishness. We think of leaders to be strong, courageous. People that we look up to, our role models, are often people that are very successful in life. And there's nothing wrong with them. But God says, along with that, consider the strength found in what the world sees as weakness. Consider the strength found in the compassion that grows in our hearts. The compassion we find through our own suffering. It's ironic to me that in this world, what creates the strongest connections between people is not our common interests, but when we can share in our suffering together. Not to be miserable together, not to wallow in our pity together, but to understand that when somebody suffers, we know what that's like. And we know we've made it through it because of the power of God's love. And now we can walk with this person. To let them know, number one, God has not abandoned them. And number two, God will see them through. Because that suffering will not be the end of their story. God's love. We know that the power of Christ on the cross, his suffering and death, was not the end of the story. But his new life, being resurrected by God's love. And so the good news of God's foolishness is that even though suffering happens to us, and we can never do anything to fully avoid it, God takes that suffering, turns it into compassion, turns it into mercy, turns it into love, turns it into our salvation. And we can use those gifts to share God's love with the world. Now, I'm still a flawed person. I have not achieved any kind of perfection in my realization of this. I still battle with my food addiction every day. I still am coping with the 10 years of my alcoholic mother, trying each day to reconcile and forgive her for all that she put me through during that time. And yet God has still called me to walk with me, to be that physical representative of God's love in this world. And God still calls you to do the same. Knowing that God will take our sufferings and turn them into a ministry of compassion and mercy, so that we can walk with each other and remind each other that the suffering is not the end of the story, but in God's foolishness, it is our salvation. Amen.